What happens when a high school teacher, used to being the smartest person in the room, challenges one of the world's most brilliant minds, Elon Musk, to a battle of wits? Paul Miller sat at his desk, the hum of the fluorescent lights above him the only sound filling the quiet classroom. His students had just left for the day, leaving him with his thoughts and a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. It was another typical day at Jefferson High School, a place that had seen better days. The walls were lined with outdated math posters, and the chalkboard was speckled with the remnants of lessons past. It was a job Paul had taken to with the confidence of someone who knew he was good at what he did. He'd been teaching math for nearly 15 years, after all. And for those 15 years, he'd been the smartest person in the room. At least, that's how it felt. But today, something was different. Today, something shifted in him as he scrolled through his phone. Elon Musk. The name lit up his screen like a beacon. Paul had just seen a headline about him starting a new project to colonize Mars, and like always, the man seemed to be at the forefront of everything: business, science, technology, you name it. Musk had a way of making the impossible seem possible. He wasn't just a billionaire tech mogul. He was a visionary, someone who challenged conventional thinking at every turn. And Paul? Well, he was a teacher in a small town, teaching students who probably would never know who Elon Musk was. But a thought crossed his mind as he read about Musk's latest venture: what if I could challenge him? It started as a joke, a passing thought in his tired mind. But as the idea grew, it began to take shape. What if he, Paul Miller, could prove he was just as smart as one of the world's greatest minds? What if he could make Musk sweat, at least for a moment, with a challenge that only a select few could understand? Math, of course. What else? Paul's mind raced as he scrolled through Twitter, searching for Musk's handle. He had nothing to lose. After all, he was known for being the go-to math guy at Jefferson High. He'd solved equations that most people couldn't even pronounce. Surely, he could hold his own in a little friendly competition. And that's when he saw it. A tweet from Elon Musk about a new math-related problem that his company was tackling. It was a casual comment, something that seemed like a throwaway, but to Paul, it felt like an invitation. The next thing he knew, he was typing furiously on his phone. "Hey at Elon Musk, I've got a calculus problem that will challenge even your brilliant mind. Care to try it?" He hit send, his heart pounding in his chest. Immediately, he felt a rush of excitement. This wasn't just a random tweet. No, this was a declaration. He was putting himself out there. And Musk? He'd either respond with a laugh or a serious challenge. Either way, it would be the kind of thrill that Paul hadn't felt in years. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, a flicker of doubt washing over him. What if Musk didn't respond? What if it was all for nothing? But then he reminded himself of the many times he'd stood in front of his classroom, facing students who were intimidated by the complexities of calculus, and yet, with every lesson, he felt like the master of his domain. This was no different. Paul leaned back in his chair, waiting for the inevitable flood of notifications. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall, 5:30 p.m. Most of his colleagues had already left, and the hallways were eerily silent. He let out a deep breath. Then, it happened. The notification appeared on his phone, the small red number at the top of the screen signifying a new message. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the app. "I'm intrigued. Let's see what you've got." It was Elon Musk. The reply was short, but it was real. Musk was actually engaging with him. Paul's mind raced. What had he just done? He'd just challenged one of the most brilliant people on the planet. But there was no backing out now. He couldn't let his students down. He couldn't let himself down. For the next few days, Paul was consumed by his mission. Every free moment he had, he pored over calculus textbooks, scouring the internet for the most difficult and intricate problems he could find. He was determined to find something that would stump Musk, something that would make him pause and take a second look. It wasn't just about winning, it was about proving something to himself, proving that he was more than just a high school teacher. He was a man who could stand toe-to-toe with the brightest minds of his generation. By the time he had crafted what he believed was the perfect problem, Paul had barely slept, his eyes red from staring at equations and derivatives. The problem was intricate, full of twists and turns, hidden patterns that would require someone to think beyond the usual tricks. This wasn't a simple calculus problem. This was a test of true intellect, one that would make even the most accomplished mathematician pause. He smiled to himself as he typed the problem out in a message, sending it to Musk with a sense of satisfaction. "Let's see if you can handle this," he thought, feeling a surge of pride. But then, as he hit send, a strange feeling began to creep over him. What if Musk was more than just an eccentric billionaire with a knack for business and innovation? What if he truly was the genius everyone said he was? Paul didn't have much time to dwell on the thought. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his reverie. It was a reply from Musk. "Interesting problem. I'll get back to you soon." Paul stared at the message, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just a random exchange anymore. This was happening. As the days passed, Paul found himself checking his phone every few minutes, desperate for a response. The world around him blurred, and the only thing that mattered was whether Musk would respond to his challenge. But deep down, a nagging feeling began to grow. What if he had bitten off more than he could chew? What if this brilliant mind, Elon Musk, would turn the tables and make Paul look foolish in the process? And that, for Paul Miller, was the true essence of the challenge. The stakes had never been higher. This was more than just math. This was about proving to the world, and to himself, that he was capable of something greater. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Paul Miller wasn't always the confident, sometimes arrogant math teacher he had become. Once, he was a student just like the ones he taught, full of potential but unsure of where it would lead. Growing up in a small town in Minnesota, Paul never quite felt like he belonged. His family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. They were just there. Paul's father, a mechanic, and his mother, a nurse, were hard-working, steady people who had always stressed the importance of stability. From an early age, Paul had shown a natural aptitude for numbers. It wasn't that he was a child prodigy, but his mind worked differently than most. While other kids were playing baseball or climbing trees, Paul was buried in math books, fascinated by the intricate puzzles they presented. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the challenge of solving something that seemed impossible. His parents didn't understand it, but they encouraged him anyway. It was a quiet encouragement, the kind that never pushed too hard but always whispered, "You can do this." In high school, Paul was the kid who would finish his homework in 5 minutes, only to be bored for the rest of the class. He wasn't the most popular or the most outgoing, but he had one thing going for him, his brain. Paul knew that he had something others didn't. He had the ability to solve problems that made his teachers scratch their heads. He was the first to raise his hand when a difficult question was posed, the first to offer a solution when no one else had one. But as he grew older, he began to feel the weight of the expectations placed on him. It wasn't enough to just be smart. He had to be something more. So, he went to college and got a degree in mathematics, thinking that a higher education would finally unlock the door to the success he craved. But what he found there was something he hadn't anticipated, a world full of people just as smart, if not smarter, than him. It was in college that Paul began to feel a sense of insecurity that would stick with him for the rest of his life. Despite his academic success, Paul had never quite learned how to handle failure. Every setback, whether it was not acing a test or being outshone by a classmate, felt like a personal attack. It wasn't just the academic failures that bothered him, it was the emotional ones. His relationships with others were strained because he couldn't figure out how to connect. He'd been so focused on being the smartest in the room that he neglected everything else: friendships, relationships, even his own mental health. After graduation, Paul took a job teaching high school math in Jefferson, a small town just outside of Chicago. It wasn't the prestigious university job he'd dreamed of, but it was steady, and he could always rely on his intellect to make an impact in the classroom. His students looked up to him, not just for his ability to teach, but for the way he made difficult subjects seem simple. In a school that was riddled with underachievement, Paul was a beacon of hope. Yet, despite his success at Jefferson, Paul still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The kids who came to him for help would smile and thank him for teaching them, but none of them seemed to truly grasp the depth of his passion for mathematics. He wasn't just teaching them to solve problems, he was teaching them how to think, how to see the world through a different lens. But it often felt like shouting into the wind. Then there was Lisa, his wife. They had met in college, both students full of ambition and promise. Lisa had been the social one, the one who could connect with anyone, and she had a way of making Paul feel seen. They got married young, too young, he sometimes thought. They had a son, Jake, shortly after, and for a while, it seemed like their little family might be the thing to anchor Paul. But even with his wife and son, Paul still felt like something was slipping through his fingers. Their relationship wasn't bad, it was just stagnant. Lisa, always the optimist, had accepted that Paul's job was more of a calling than a career. But as the years went by, she began to notice that Paul wasn't really present. He was physically there, sure, but emotionally, not so much. He poured all his energy into teaching, into solving problems, into finding the next challenge. But the problems at home, the ones that didn't involve numbers, began to stack up. Lisa wanted to connect more, wanted more from their relationship, but Paul was always so caught up in his own thoughts that he couldn't see how far they were drifting apart. Jake, their son, had inherited Paul's sharp mind, but he had also inherited his father's emotional distance. While Paul was proud of Jake's intelligence, he couldn't help but worry that his son was also following in his footsteps. He was too focused on numbers and facts, just like Paul had been at his age. And as Jake entered high school, Paul realized that he had become the same kind of father that his own dad had been, distant, unable to fully connect. It was on one of those quiet nights, when Paul was sitting at his desk grading papers, that he stumbled upon the article about Elon Musk. Paul had heard of Musk before, of course. Who hadn't? The man was everywhere, on TV, in the news, on social media. He had revolutionized the electric car industry, launched rockets into space, and now, he was planning to send humans to Mars. To Paul, it seemed like Musk was the kind of person who had everything figured out. He was the kind of person who had used his genius to change the world. Paul envied Musk. Not just for his wealth or his accomplishments, but for his ability to think outside the box, to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. For the first time in years, Paul found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. What if he could be like Musk? What if he could be the person who solved problems in a new way, who challenged the status quo? What if he could prove, once and for all, that his intellect was enough to make a difference? And that's when the idea struck him. He had nothing to lose. He had been the smartest person in the room for years, but he had never been tested by someone truly brilliant. What if he could challenge Elon Musk? What if he could take him on, not in business, but in the one area where Paul was still sure of his abilities, mathematics? As Paul sat there, his mind raced with the possibilities. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room anymore. He needed to be the bravest. And so, Paul Miller, high school math teacher, sent his challenge to Elon Musk. Little did he know, this decision would change the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. The days that followed Paul Miller's challenge to Elon Musk felt like a whirlwind. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart would leap, but with each passing day, the silence grew louder. Paul had hoped that Musk would respond quickly, perhaps even with the same enthusiasm that had driven Paul to send that initial tweet. But it wasn't until nearly a week later that Paul received a message from the tech mogul that would send his world into a tailspin. It was a simple text, short and to the point, but its impact was undeniable. "I'm ready for your challenge. Send the problem." Paul couldn't believe it. For a moment, he stared at his phone, the message burning into his mind. He wasn't sure whether to be ecstatic, terrified, or both. Musk, the man who had revolutionized space exploration and electric vehicles, was about to take on a problem designed by him. A high school math teacher from a small town. The magnitude of the situation slowly began to sink in, and with it came a growing wave of doubt. What had he gotten himself into? The last few days had been filled with endless preparation, endless tweaking of the calculus problem he'd crafted. It was a complex series of integrals, derivatives, and a tricky application of multivariable calculus, one that Paul believed only someone with Musk's mathematical background would even attempt to solve. But now that it was finally time to send it off, Paul found himself questioning the very thing that had given him confidence to begin with. What if the problem was too difficult? What if Musk laughed at him for thinking a simple math teacher could outsmart him? What if Musk solved it in an instant, making Paul look like a fool? Paul had been through plenty of challenges in his life, but this was different. This was more than a test of his ability as a teacher. This was a test of his self-worth. The idea of going toe-to-toe with one of the brightest minds on the planet was thrilling, and terrifying, at the same time. The clock ticked past midnight, and Paul sat alone at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to send the problem. For a moment, he hesitated. He thought back to his years of teaching, the students he had helped, the moments when he felt truly proud of his work. But now, all of that seemed so small in comparison to the magnitude of this moment. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a man who had stepped into the unknown, challenging a genius to a game of intellect. With a deep breath, Paul pressed send. The message, accompanied by the math problem, was now in Musk's hands. Paul sat back in his chair, waiting. The silence in his classroom felt deafening. Hours passed with no reply. The minutes turned into an hour, then two, and finally, just as Paul was beginning to lose hope, the notification popped up on his screen. Elon Musk had responded. "I've looked over the problem. It's interesting, but there's a small part of the solution that doesn't seem right. Can you clarify your approach to the integral in the second part? Let's see if we can work through this together." Paul blinked, rereading the message. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't even a criticism. It was collaborative. Musk was asking for clarification, showing an interest in discussing the problem rather than simply solving it and moving on. A rush of relief flooded through Paul. This wasn't just an answer to a math problem anymore, it was a conversation. Musk wasn't trying to make Paul feel foolish, he was engaging with him. It was the kind of exchange Paul had only dreamed of with his students. He wasn't just a teacher, in this moment, he was on equal footing with one of the greatest minds alive. But then, as the conversation began to unfold, Paul realized something. Musk wasn't just asking for clarification on one part of the problem. He was diving deeper. Musk was poking holes in the logic, testing the limits of Paul's understanding. Every response he received from Musk left Paul feeling more and more inadequate. It was like trying to keep up with a whirlwind, a constant barrage of questions and observations that, in many ways, were making Paul question everything he had built his confidence on. For the first time in years, Paul felt truly challenged in a way he hadn't expected. Musk's sharp intellect wasn't just a source of awe, it was now a reminder of his own limitations. Paul was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one everyone turned to for answers. But now, he wasn't in a classroom filled with high school students. He was facing off with someone who had outgrown all the rules Paul had relied on. Each response Musk sent seemed to unravel the comfortable world Paul had created for himself. His pride, his identity as the teacher who knew all the answers, was being slowly dismantled by the very person he had admired from afar. But this wasn't the end, at least not yet. If anything, it was the beginning of something far bigger than Paul had ever imagined. "I see where the issue is now," Musk replied a few hours later. "But I'm curious, have you considered applying the concept of time dilation in this problem? It's a strange approach, but it might open up new possibilities." Paul sat there, stunned. Time dilation. The concept had only ever been a vague idea to him, something he'd read about in physics books but never truly understood. But now, Musk was pushing him to apply it to a math problem, something that hadn't even crossed Paul's mind. It was clear that this wasn't just about math anymore. This was about ego, about identity. It was about who Paul Miller was, and who he wanted to be. Could he admit that he didn't know everything? Could he learn from Musk, the very person he had once hoped to challenge? Paul took a deep breath, feeling a mix of frustration and exhilaration. He could have given up. He could have ended the conversation there, sending a quick reply that suggested he didn't quite understand and that he would move on. But something inside him refused to back down. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Not without a fight. "You're right," Paul typed, his fingers trembling slightly. "I hadn't thought about time dilation. Let's explore that idea." As he hit send, a wave of anticipation filled him. This was just the beginning. But Paul knew that no matter what happened, his world would never be the same. He had stepped into uncharted territory, and there was no going back now. The days following Paul's admission to Musk about the time dilation concept felt like a fever dream. What had started as a seemingly simple intellectual challenge had now evolved into something much deeper, much more personal. Paul wasn't just solving math problems anymore, he was grappling with his own insecurities, his pride, and a profound realization that no matter how much he knew, there was always more to learn. But none of this would have been possible without Musk's subtle but intense drive to push Paul past his limits. Every new message from Musk forced Paul to rethink everything he had taken for granted about math and about himself. Musk had suggested using time dilation to expand the scope of the problem, an idea that Paul initially dismissed as too abstract. But as he began to explore it, he realized how incredibly transformative it could be, both in theory and in practice. It was a breakthrough. With each email, text, or message that came through, Paul felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. He would spend hours poring over every word, rereading every concept Musk introduced, trying to absorb it all. The problem had expanded into something vast, much more complicated than Paul had ever imagined. What had started as a simple calculus problem now involved not just math, but the principles of physics, relativity, velocity, time, and space, and every solution brought a new layer of complexity. But the complexity wasn't the hardest part. No, what truly stung was the realization that Paul had been wrong in his assumptions. His approach to the problem, everything he had thought was a clever solution, was incomplete. Every time Musk challenged him, Paul felt his certainty begin to crumble. He'd spent years teaching his students with confidence, imparting what he believed was correct. But now, under the scrutiny of Musk's sharp eye, those lessons seemed incomplete, flawed even. At first, Paul had dismissed this feeling of inadequacy. He was the teacher, after all, the one with the expertise. But soon, as he continued this back and forth, he came to terms with the uncomfortable truth: his knowledge was just a starting point. There was more to learn, more to explore, and he had been too rigid in his thinking for far too long. Musk's messages were demanding, and with every question Musk posed, Paul felt the familiar weight of frustration. But beneath that frustration was something else, a spark. It was the spark of curiosity, of excitement. For the first time in years, Paul felt like a student again, being guided through a world of new possibilities. The world of math had never seemed so vast, and yet, so personal. One evening, after a particularly tough exchange with Musk about the application of quantum mechanics to the problem, Paul sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop. His mind was swirling with equations, theories, and concepts that felt like they were slipping through his fingers. It was just math, but it felt like much more. It felt like everything he had been teaching for years had been turned upside down in a matter of days. But then, there was a moment of clarity. Paul sat up straighter in his chair, eyes scanning the screen. When it hit him, he had been missing the key to the whole problem. It wasn't about finding the right answer, but understanding how the layers of information connected. He hadn't just been working through the math, he'd been working through his own approach to learning and teaching. The realization came in a rush: he didn't have to know everything. He didn't have to be the one with all the answers. He just needed to be open to the process, to the exploration, to the journey of discovery. It was as if the fog had lifted. The weight of perfectionism, of always having to be the smartest, was suddenly gone. Paul realized that the real lesson here was not about solving this problem in isolation, but about collaboration, learning from someone else, growing together. Musk had never asked him to be perfect. He had simply pushed Paul to be better. So, with newfound resolve, Paul typed his response to Musk. "I think I finally see it. The problem isn't just about solving the equation, it's about understanding the relationships between the variables in ways I hadn't considered before." Time dilation was the key to expanding the dimensions of the problem, but the true challenge lies in how these concepts fit together. It's not a single answer but a journey of exploration. Let's dive deeper. Paul hit send, his heart racing. He had taken a step forward, not just in math, but in his own growth as a teacher, as a thinker, and as a person. The problem had no immediate solution, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, Paul didn't need a solution. He needed the journey. The next morning, a response came from Musk, and when Paul saw the words, "Great progress," on his screen, he felt a sense of relief and excitement wash over him. This wasn't just a victory in math. This was a victory in life. As the back and forth between Paul and Musk continued, something shifted. What had initially been an intellectual battle between a teacher and a genius had become a deeply personal experience for Paul. Musk's sharp intellect, though sometimes intimidating, was pushing him to new limits. But in the process, it was also exposing a raw vulnerability within Paul that he hadn't felt in years. In all the years Paul had taught, he had prided himself on being the authority, the one who had the answers. He had constructed a comfortable life, built on the belief that knowledge was power, and in his classroom, he was the one with the key. But here, in this digital arena with Elon Musk, Paul found himself completely stripped of his usual confidence. Musk was relentless in his pursuit of deeper answers, questions that pushed Paul to examine his assumptions about not just math, but life itself. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling exchange, Paul sat in his classroom, staring blankly at the whiteboard. He had made progress in the problem, but it wasn't the math that occupied his thoughts, it was the growing realization that he had been playing it safe for too long. For years, he had avoided taking risks, afraid of failure, afraid of being wrong. The intellectual challenge of this math problem had dug up something buried deep within him, the fear that he was never truly living up to his potential. The truth was, Paul was scared. Scared of being exposed as someone who wasn't as brilliant as he had always portrayed himself to be. It wasn't just the fear of failure in solving the problem, it was the fear of failure as a person. He had been hiding behind the role of teacher for so long, using it as a shield to protect himself from his own shortcomings. But now, facing Elon Musk's constant probing, Paul couldn't hide from his own doubts anymore. Am I really enough? Paul whispered to himself, the words catching in his throat. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped away the smudge of chalk on the board, only to have a new, deeper anxiety settle in. He had built his identity around his intellect, but Musk had forced him to confront a more uncomfortable truth: intellect alone wasn't enough. It never had been. And in the wake of this realization, Paul felt small, insignificant, like the very foundation of his existence was crumbling. The emotional weight of it all hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just dealing with the pressure of solving the problem, He was facing the realization that his entire life had been spent running from the deeper issues, his fear of failure, his inability to connect with others, and the persistent gnawing sense that he wasn't truly living up to the greatness he'd once envisioned for himself. Musk's critiques, though they had stung, were revealing truths that Paul had buried for years. And it wasn't just about the math, it was about his life's work. His teaching, his marriage, his fatherhood, all of it had been built on a fragile foundation of pride, arrogance, and the need for approval. The room seemed to spin around him as the emotions swirled. For a brief moment, Paul felt like quitting. He could walk away, forget the challenge with Musk, pretend none of this had ever happened. He could go back to the comfort of his predictable life, where he was in control, where he was the one with the answers. But deep down, Paul knew that doing so would only perpetuate the cycle of fear and avoidance that had defined his life. He realized that facing the challenge, not just in math but in himself, was the only way forward. At that moment, something clicked inside him. Paul wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. No, this challenge, this struggle, was the catalyst for something more profound than he could have imagined. He had been living his life according to rules he hadn't even questioned, rules that had stifled his growth. The math problem was only the beginning. With newfound determination, Paul grabbed his laptop, fired up his email, and began typing. Elon, I see it now. This problem isn't just a test of math, it's a test of everything I've been avoiding. I've realized that to truly solve this, I need to let go of the fear of being wrong. It's the same fear that's held me back in life. I've been hiding behind the comfort of certainty, but I see now that to truly move forward, I have to be willing to step into the unknown, embrace the uncertainty. Let's take this to the next level. He sent the message, feeling a sense of relief wash over him, as if he had just laid bare the deepest parts of his soul. The reply came faster than he expected. Well said, Paul. That's exactly what we need. Let's see where this takes us. Reading Musk's words, Paul couldn't help but feel a sense of connection. It wasn't about winning the challenge anymore, it was about something far greater, personal growth, the courage to face his fears, and the humility to admit that he didn't have all the answers. For the first time in his life, Paul felt truly free. As Paul sat back in his chair, reading Elon Musk's brief but encouraging response, a wave of relief washed over him. For the first time in days, the crushing pressure that had been building inside him seemed to dissipate. It wasn't because he had solved the problem, nor because he had outsmarted Musk, far from it. It was because, in that moment, Paul realized that the challenge wasn't about intellectual victory. It wasn't even about math. It was about growth. It was about shedding the rigid framework of fear and self-doubt that had held him back for so many years. Musk's challenge had pushed him to confront the one thing that had been buried deep within him, his unwillingness to be vulnerable, to accept that being wrong, or not having all the answers, was part of the process of truly learning and evolving. Paul's journey had come full circle. The days following that pivotal exchange were filled with new excitement and energy. The once daunting math problem now felt like a playground of possibilities. With each message from Musk, Paul felt his confidence grow, not because he was getting every answer right, but because he had learned to embrace the uncertainty of it all. Every challenge Musk posed was no longer something to fear, but an opportunity to discover, to push the boundaries of what he knew, and, perhaps more importantly, to learn more about himself. The deeper he dove into the problem, the more he found his personal life reflecting the very same principles he was applying to math. Paul had spent years hiding behind his identity as a teacher, the expert in the room. But what he'd never allowed himself to realize was that teaching wasn't just about giving answers, it was about being open to learning alongside his students, just as he was now learning from Musk. There was no shame in vulnerability, no shame in admitting that he didn't know everything. In fact, it was this very humility that allowed him to truly grow as a person and as a teacher. One evening, after spending hours refining the math problem with Musk, Paul took a walk around his neighborhood, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The stars above him shone brightly, and the weight of the past few weeks, of the doubts and the fears, seemed to lift. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that had been missing for so long. As he walked, Paul reflected on everything that had transpired, the initial challenge, the struggles, the feelings of inadequacy, and the eventual breakthrough. He thought about his wife, Sarah, and their children. For years, he had buried himself in his work, thinking that being a great teacher meant sacrificing everything else. But in the midst of this unexpected challenge with Musk, Paul had come to realize that the true essence of being a great teacher, and a great person, was not in isolation. It was in connection. Connection to others, to ideas, and most importantly, to oneself. When Paul returned home, he sat down with Sarah, his partner and confidant, and shared the journey he had been on. He told her about the math problem, the intellectual sparring with Musk, and the personal revelations that had shaken him to his core. Sarah listened intently, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. When he finished, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm proud of you, Paul," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Not because of the math or the challenge with Musk, but because you're finally seeing yourself the way I've always seen you, not just as the teacher, but as the man you've always been, capable of more than you realize." Tears welled up in Paul's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel vulnerable in her presence. He had been so focused on proving himself, on building his identity around his intellect, that he had forgotten the most important truth, that his worth wasn't tied to how much he knew, but to who he was as a person. It was then that Paul realized something important. The lesson wasn't in the math. It wasn't in solving complex problems or proving his intelligence. The true lesson was in the process itself, the act of learning, of growing, and of allowing himself to embrace uncertainty. It was about connection, both with others and with the deeper parts of himself. The challenge with Musk had forced Paul to step outside his comfort zone, to confront his fears, and to learn that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. By stepping into the unknown, by embracing the discomfort of not having all the answers, he had discovered a freedom he never knew existed. As he looked at Sarah, his heart swelled with gratitude. He had always thought that being the smartest person in the room was the key to success. But now, he saw the truth: success wasn't defined by how much you knew, it was defined by how much you were willing to learn, to grow, and to connect with the people who mattered most. Paul had learned that the road to greatness wasn't about winning or being the best. It was about humility, openness, and the willingness to keep moving forward, even when the path was uncertain. And as for the math problem, well, that wasn't the point anymore. The journey, the learning, the growth, the emotional roller coaster, had been worth far more than any final answer ever could be. In the end, Paul Miller's challenge with Elon Musk became more than just a contest of intellect. It became a journey of personal transformation, of confronting fears, embracing vulnerability, and learning to see the world, and himself, in a new light. Paul had learned that it was okay to not have all the answers, to not always be the smartest person in the room. The true essence of life, he discovered, was in the journey of learning, in the willingness to embrace uncertainty, and in the connections we make along the way. And, as for Musk, well, they never did finish that calculus problem. But Paul didn't need to. What mattered was the lesson that had emerged from their exchange, a lesson that would continue to shape his life, both inside and outside the classroom, for years to come. As the weeks passed since Paul's revelation and the emotional roller coaster of his challenge with Elon Musk, the world outside his classroom slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. However, Paul was no longer the same man who had walked into that initial confrontation with Musk. The internal shift was profound, and as much as he tried to return to his previous routines, he couldn't shake the changes that had taken place within him. The first sign of this change came in the form of his interactions with his students. Paul had always been a dedicated teacher, but now, when he entered his classroom, he felt an entirely different energy. He no longer viewed himself solely as an authority figure or a dispenser of knowledge. Instead, he saw himself as a fellow learner, someone who was just as invested in the process of discovery as his students. One morning, during a particularly challenging calculus lesson, Paul was explaining a difficult concept on the board when he noticed something. A student, Emily, was furiously scribbling notes but kept glancing up at the clock, her face filled with frustration. Normally, Paul would have continued without a second thought, but something in him nudged him to pause. Instead of rushing through the lesson, he stopped and turned to the class. "Emily," Paul said, addressing the student directly, "it seems like you're having a hard time with this. Is there something about the concept that's not clicking?" Emily hesitated for a moment before she spoke, her voice small. "It's just that no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get it. I feel like I'm just not good enough." Paul's heart sank. He knew that feeling too well, the feeling of struggling and doubting yourself, the fear of never being good enough. It was a feeling he had experienced many times in his own life, especially during his challenge with Musk. Instead of brushing it off or offering a simple answer, Paul took a step back. He smiled at Emily. "You know," he said, his voice filled with empathy, "sometimes, the hardest thing is not the math itself, but the feeling that you should already have the answer. The truth is, no one gets everything on the first try, and that's okay. The journey to understanding is messy, and it often takes longer than we expect. But if you stick with it, keep asking questions, and remain open to the process, it will click eventually." The students in the room were silent for a moment, their eyes on Paul, and then, to his surprise, Emily smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was a small victory, a recognition that it was okay to not have it all figured out right away. It was okay to struggle, to fail, and to try again. That was the heart of learning. Over the next few weeks, Paul began incorporating this approach into his teaching philosophy. He no longer felt the need to be the perfect teacher who had all the answers. Instead, he became a facilitator of learning, someone who encouraged his students to explore, to question, and to embrace the uncertainty of the journey. He found that when he let go of the need to control every aspect of his lessons, his students flourished. They were less afraid to make mistakes, to ask questions, and to take risks in their learning. At home, things were no different. Paul's newfound openness and vulnerability bled into his relationship with Sarah and their children. His conversations with Sarah became deeper, more authentic. He found himself sharing his struggles with her more openly, and in return, Sarah did the same. It wasn't that they hadn't been open with each other before, but now, their relationship felt different, it felt more real. One evening, as Paul and Sarah sat together on the couch, Sarah turned to him and said, "You've changed, Paul. I can see it in the way you interact with the kids, with your students, and even with me. There's this calmness about you now. It's like you've finally let go of the pressure to be perfect." Paul nodded, his eyes softening. "I have. I think I was always so caught up in proving myself, in being the smartest person in the room. But now I realize that being perfect isn't the goal. It's about being present, being real, and being open to learning, both in my work and in my life." The relief he felt from Sarah's understanding was immense. For years, Paul had been living under the pressure of expectations he had placed on himself and, unknowingly, that others had placed on him too. But now, he felt free from that weight. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be himself. That freedom extended to his relationship with his children as well. He found himself spending more quality time with them, not as the authoritative father figure, but as a partner in their growth. They played games together, explored new hobbies, and had long, meaningful conversations that stretched far beyond schoolwork. But there was one last piece to the puzzle that Paul had yet to address, the final conclusion of his journey with Elon Musk. Despite the emotional and intellectual breakthroughs Paul had experienced, the math problem was still unresolved. In some ways, it no longer mattered to him. The challenge had never been about proving himself, it had been about uncovering the deeper truths about his life, his identity, and his capacity for growth. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something left unfinished. One morning, several weeks after their last exchange, Paul opened his inbox to find a new message from Musk. His heart skipped a beat. The subject line read, let's finish what we started. Paul clicked open the message, and there it was. Musk had come up with a new insight, a breakthrough of his own. With a few mathematical refinements, they were close to solving the problem. Paul smiled, reading the message carefully. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the realization that this wasn't just about the final answer. It was about the journey, the process of discovery, and the collaboration. He typed his response. "I'm ready. Let's finish this together." And with that, the final chapter of their intellectual journey began to unfold, not with a rush of triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the most important discoveries aren't the ones we find, but the ones we learn along the way. The email from Elon Musk had reignited something in Paul. It wasn't just the math problem that he was eager to solve anymore, it was the fact that this challenge, this connection with Musk, had evolved into something far more significant. He had grown, personally and intellectually, through every exchange, every question, every uncertainty. The math problem was no longer a puzzle to conquer but a symbol of everything he had learned about embracing vulnerability, growth, and change. As Paul sat at his desk, looking at Musk's message once more, he took a deep breath. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but for a moment, he just let the silence sink in. He wasn't in a rush to respond. In fact, he knew that this moment was different from any other. The pressure to perform, to solve the problem for the sake of proving himself, had faded. Now, it was about the process itself, the process of collaboration and mutual respect, of continuing the journey they had started together. "Let's finish this together." Musk's words echoed in his mind. Paul began to type. "Elon, I've been thinking about everything we've discussed over the past few weeks. It's no longer just about solving the problem, it's about learning, growing, and pushing ourselves beyond what we think we know. I'm ready to take this next step. Let's finish this." He hit send, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The act of writing those words felt like closing a chapter, but also opening a new one. It wasn't just about completing the task, they were both part of something bigger now. Minutes later, Musk replied, as direct and focused as ever. "Great, Paul. Here's my latest insight. I've made some adjustments. We're close, but it'll take both of us to get there. Let's do this." Paul smiled, shaking his head slightly. Musk's style hadn't changed one bit, sharp, to the point, and relentless. But there was something reassuring about it. Paul could almost hear the energy and drive in Musk's words, the same passion that had fueled his entire career. It reminded him that despite all their differences, they were both on the same side, a side of exploration and discovery. They worked tirelessly over the next few days, sending back and forth emails filled with equations, explanations, and new ideas. Paul wasn't solving the problem by himself, nor was Musk. It was a true partnership, a coming together of two minds, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. They each had their moments of doubt, but rather than trying to hide those moments, they embraced them. Every failure was a stepping stone, and every small breakthrough became a moment to celebrate. One evening, Paul sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. They were close, so close to solving the problem. His mind raced with excitement and disbelief. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of finality, not just with the math, but with the journey itself. Then, the breakthrough came. Musk had made a final adjustment to the equation, and after a few tense moments of calculation, Paul realized that they had done it. The answer, complex and elegant, appeared on the screen in front of him. It wasn't a loud victory. There were no cheers, no grand celebrations. But Paul felt something deep within him, something he hadn't expected. It was a quiet sense of accomplishment, not because he had proven himself right, but because he had learned to let go of his fear and embrace the journey. The answer wasn't just a mathematical solution, it was the answer to his own personal growth, a testament to the fact that even when the road seems uncertain, persistence and vulnerability can lead to unexpected triumphs. Paul quickly drafted one last email to Musk. "We did it. I think we've cracked it. This was never just about the answer, though, it was about everything we've learned along the way. Thank you, Elon. Musk's reply came within moments. It's been a hell of a journey, Paul. The answer is important, but the real lesson is in how we got there. Let's keep pushing the limits of what we can do together. Reading those words, Paul felt a warmth in his chest. There it was, the true victory. It wasn't in the completion of the task, it was in the mutual respect and understanding they had built. In the end, that was the real answer. The months following the completion of the calculus challenge felt like a whirlwind for Paul. His life had transformed in ways he had never anticipated. The lessons he had learned during his exchange with Elon Musk were embedded deeply in his psyche, influencing everything he did, both personally and professionally. Paul had gone from being a teacher who hid behind his intellect and authority to someone who embraced the uncertainty of life, someone who was willing to grow, make mistakes, and learn from them. His students noticed the change. They saw a teacher who wasn't just lecturing at them, but engaging with them in ways that invited them to learn alongside him. They felt safe to ask questions, to stumble, and to try again. In the end, the lessons they learned weren't just about calculus, they were about how to approach life with curiosity and an open heart. At home, Paul's relationship with Sarah was stronger than ever. The bond they shared, once clouded by the pressures of his career, had deepened. They spent more time together, shared more experiences, and communicated more honestly. The vulnerability that had once terrified Paul had become the cornerstone of their relationship. For the first time in years, Paul felt fully present, not just as a father and husband, but as a partner who was ready to build a future based on growth and love, not perfection. And Musk? Their professional relationship continued to flourish. Although they never embarked on another math challenge together, Paul and Elon maintained a mutual respect for each other's perspectives. The emails continued to fly back and forth, more about ideas and innovation than math, and Paul found himself inspired by Musk's relentless pursuit of progress. In the end, Paul knew that this journey with Musk had been about far more than solving a complex equation. It had been about shedding the fears that had held him back, about learning to embrace vulnerability, and about discovering the power of connection. The real lesson, Paul realized, was that the process of learning, growing, and evolving was never truly over. It was a journey without an endpoint, one that continued to unfold, every day. This concludes Paul's story, but the journey itself? That's still just beginning. It had been a few months since Paul and Elon Musk had cracked the calculus problem, and life, as it often does, continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Though Paul's world had shifted dramatically, both personally and professionally, the ripple effects of that challenge were just beginning to make their presence known. At work, Paul had become something of a local legend. Not only had he solved one of the most complicated math problems in recent history, but he had done so with humility, integrity, and a willingness to learn. He was no longer just the teacher who stood at the front of the classroom, explaining concepts to his students. Instead, he had transformed into a mentor, someone who encouraged his students to think beyond the page, to question everything, and to embrace failure as a part of the learning process. One afternoon, as Paul walked into his classroom, he found a group of students gathered around his desk, eagerly discussing a problem on the board. Mr. Richardson, one of the students, Jason, called out. "We've been working on this problem for an hour, and we can't figure it out. Can you help us?" Paul smiled and walked over, glancing at the board. The problem was a tricky one, a multi-step calculus equation that required a deep understanding of both limits and derivatives. But instead of immediately giving them the answer, Paul paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not going to give you the answer," he said calmly. "But I will tell you this, every single problem we face, every equation, every challenge, is just another opportunity to learn. It's not about getting it right the first time. It's about pushing yourself and getting better with every attempt." Jason looked at Paul with a raised eyebrow. "So, you're saying we should just keep trying? Even if we're stuck?" "Exactly," Paul replied. "And don't be afraid to fail. I know what it feels like to hit a wall, but sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come after we've faced the most difficult challenges. Remember, the key is to be persistent and curious." The students nodded, and Paul could see the spark of inspiration in their eyes. He could tell they were starting to grasp what he was saying, not just about the math, but about life itself. They didn't need a perfect answer, not right away. What mattered was that they were asking the right questions and learning from the process. Later that day, Paul sat in his office, reflecting on how far he had come. The past year had been a whirlwind. He had gone from being a teacher who thought he had all the answers to a teacher who embraced uncertainty and the idea that learning was an ongoing journey. It hadn't always been easy, and there were still moments of doubt. But he had learned to accept those moments, to recognize that growth wasn't a straight path, and that sometimes the most meaningful lessons came from the struggle. As he sat back in his chair, Paul's phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "How's your day going? I was thinking we should plan a weekend getaway soon, somewhere quiet, away from everything. Just us and the kids. What do you think?" Paul smiled. He loved the idea of getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It felt like the perfect opportunity to recharge, to reconnect with his family, and to give himself the space to reflect on everything that had happened in the past few months. He quickly replied, "That sounds perfect. Let's make it happen. I'll take care of the details. I think we all need a break." But just as he hit send, another message popped up, this one from an unexpected source. It was from Elon Musk. "Paul, I've been thinking. We need to meet in person. I'm working on a new project that I believe could change the way we approach education. It's ambitious, but I think you might be the perfect person to help me bring it to life. Are you interested?" Paul's heart skipped a beat. The last time they had interacted, they had solved a problem together, but he hadn't expected Musk to reach out with another opportunity. He read the message again, then put his phone down, lost in thought. The prospect of working with Musk on a new educational project was both exciting and overwhelming. Paul had never imagined that his relationship with Musk would evolve into something more than just a one-time collaboration. But now, it seemed like the universe was offering him a chance to take his passion for education to a whole new level. After a few moments of contemplation, Paul typed his response. "Elon, I'm intrigued. Let's discuss this further. When and where are you thinking?" The reply came swiftly. "I'll have my assistant set up a meeting for next week. Let's make it happen." Paul leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could this be the next chapter in his journey? He had never considered working on a project of such scale, but the idea of collaborating with someone like Elon Musk was undeniably tempting. It wasn't just about the prestige or the excitement of working on something groundbreaking. It was about the possibility of impacting education on a global scale, of shaping the future in a way he had never imagined. But as he thought about it, Paul realized that this opportunity would come with its own set of challenges. It would take time, effort, and commitment, things he would need to balance with his responsibilities as a teacher and a father. The weight of this decision was not lost on him, but he couldn't help but feel that it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. Later that evening, Paul sat with Sarah, sharing the news of Elon's proposal. She listened intently, her eyes thoughtful. When he finished, she took a deep breath and said, "You've worked hard to get to this point, Paul. This could be a huge opportunity for you, for all of us. But I want you to think about it carefully. It's going to change things, and we'll need to adjust. You'll have to figure out what you want more, working with Elon on this project, or staying with the teaching work you've built here." Paul nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. This decision would affect not just him, but their entire family. And yet, deep down, he knew that whatever path he chose, it would be a part of the ongoing journey of growth and discovery that had defined his life over the past year. As they discussed the possibilities late into the night, Paul felt a sense of clarity. The next chapter was waiting for him, and it was up to him to decide whether to take the leap. But no matter what, he knew one thing for certain: the journey he had embarked on was far from over. The next week arrived with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Paul had been juggling his regular teaching duties, his family life, and the persistent pull of the opportunity Elon Musk had presented. He had tried to keep his mind focused on his students and his family, but every so often, his thoughts would wander back to that message. "Are you interested?" Musk had asked. And every time Paul thought about it, the answer seemed to be yes, he was interested. But the weight of the decision lingered, refusing to be ignored. The night before his scheduled meeting with Musk, Paul couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind racing through the possibilities. What would working with Elon Musk on a new educational project mean? What kind of changes would it bring? Would he be able to balance his passion for teaching with the demands of such a high-profile collaboration? In the quiet of the early morning hours, Paul found himself thinking back to the first time he had solved a math problem with Elon Musk. It had felt like a simple equation at the time, just math, numbers, and formulas. But now, it was clear that the equation had been much more than that. It had been the beginning of something bigger, something that had transformed his perspective on education, growth, and personal development. This new project, whatever it was, could be the next step in that journey, a chance to create something that could impact generations of students. But then came the voice in his head, "What about the students you're teaching now? What about your family?" He could already see the faces of his students, the young minds that had come to trust him, to look to him not just for knowledge, but for guidance. Could he really leave them behind for a project with Musk? What would his family think about the time commitment, the demands, and the possible sacrifices? Sarah had been supportive, but even she had her doubts. "I just want you to be sure about this," she had said the night before. "It's not just about the opportunity. It's about how it changes everything. How it changes you. And us." Paul had promised to think it through carefully, but now, on the eve of the meeting, it all seemed so overwhelming. His career, his family, his passion for teaching, it was all at stake. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Paul realized that the decision wasn't just about a project. It was about his own future, about what kind of person he wanted to be and what legacy he wanted to leave behind. Was he ready to step out of his comfort zone? Was he willing to sacrifice a part of himself for the possibility of a larger impact? Before he knew it, the sun was rising, and the day of the meeting had arrived. He quickly showered, dressed, and grabbed a quick breakfast before heading to the office. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove, but there was a certain clarity starting to form in his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the only way to grow was to take risks, to face the unknown with courage and curiosity. He couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. By the time he arrived at the meeting, Paul had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let the fear of change paralyze him. Whatever happened, he would face it with an open mind and an open heart. The meeting with Elon Musk was set in a sleek conference room, a stark contrast to the small, humble classrooms Paul was used to. As he walked in, Musk was already seated, his usual focused expression in place. He greeted Paul with a firm handshake and gestured to the chair across from him. "Thanks for coming, Paul. I'm excited to dive into this," Musk said, his voice carrying the usual energy Paul had come to associate with him. "Thanks for reaching out," Paul replied, taking his seat. "I'm intrigued by what you've been working on." Musk wasted no time. "I've been thinking about the future of education. We've seen how technology has disrupted so many industries. But education has remained largely the same for decades. It's time to change that. I want to create something that's not just about delivering information, but about changing the way students learn and experience the world." Paul listened intently, his mind racing. He could feel the excitement in Musk's words, the passion that had driven some of the greatest innovations of our time. This was more than just a project, it was a revolution in education. "I'm in," Paul said, almost before he realized it. The words came out of his mouth so naturally, with a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. "I'm in, Elon. Let's do it." Musk's eyes lit up. That's what I like to hear. We're going to need someone who understands the real-world classroom, someone who knows what works and what doesn't. You'll be a critical part of this. As the meeting continued, Musk outlined his vision for the project. It would involve developing new technologies and methods for teaching that blended the best of traditional education with cutting-edge innovations. The goal was to create an adaptive learning platform that could reach students at their individual levels, helping them to grow not just academically, but emotionally and socially as well. It's about making learning accessible and engaging for everyone, no matter their background or situation, Musk explained. We're talking about global-scale impact, Paul. This could change everything. The weight of the words hit Paul in that moment. Global-scale impact. This wasn't just about a new teaching tool. This was about changing the entire educational landscape. The responsibility was immense. The potential was boundless. But Paul knew, deep down, that this was the right step. It wasn't just about following Musk's lead, it was about forging his own path, about being part of something that could make a real difference in the world. After the meeting, Paul left with a sense of determination. The decision had been made. He would embark on this new journey with Musk, but he would do so with the lessons he had learned from his time in the classroom. He would carry with him the values of humility, persistence, and the belief that every student could succeed if given the right opportunities. As Paul sat in his car, ready to drive home, he felt a wave of peace settle over him. The crossroads had been daunting, but now, as he looked ahead, he saw a clear path. He wasn't stepping away from his teaching career, he was taking it to the next level. And this time, he wasn't afraid to take the leap. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? In the weeks following his decision to join Elon Musk's ambitious educational project, Paul found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, he was still deeply embedded in his role as a high school teacher, standing in front of his students, guiding them through calculus problems and encouraging them to believe in their potential. On the other hand, he was preparing to dive into a cutting-edge project that had the power to reshape the future of education. At first, it felt like a delicate balance. Paul would spend his mornings in the classroom, teaching and mentoring his students, and then head to Musk's headquarters in the afternoons for meetings and brainstorming sessions. The pace was grueling, and the hours were long, but Paul thrived on the excitement of it all. Every time he walked into a meeting with Musk and the rest of the team, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. But as the weeks went on, the tension began to build. The demands of the project were intensifying, and Paul found himself staying up late, working on new curriculum designs, contributing to software development ideas, and coordinating with other educators to ensure the project would address real-world classroom needs. It was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. One evening, as Paul sat at his desk at home, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "How's everything going? You've been working so much lately. Are you okay?" Paul read the message and sighed. He knew Sarah was worried. She had been so supportive when he decided to take on this new challenge, but he could tell that the strain of his schedule was beginning to show. They hadn't had a real conversation in days, and he missed the quiet evenings they used to spend together. He quickly typed a reply. "I'm good. Just a lot going on right now. But I promise I'll make time for us this weekend. We could use a break, don't you think?" The message sent, but Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Sarah's initial excitement for the project had faded into concern. She wasn't used to him being so distracted, so distant. And if he was being honest with himself, neither was he. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Paul reflected on how quickly things had changed. He had jumped into this project with a sense of urgency, driven by the idea that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But in the process, he had let the things that mattered most, his family, his sense of balance, and his connection to the present moment, slip through his fingers. The next morning, Paul met with Elon and the rest of the team at the project headquarters. They were sitting around a large table, brainstorming ideas for the new educational platform. Musk was enthusiastic as always, presenting his vision of a world where every student could learn at their own pace, where technology and personalized learning would eliminate barriers, and where education could be truly transformative. You see, the beauty of this project, Musk said, leaning forward, is that we're not just creating another learning app. We're creating an ecosystem, a system that adapts to the student's needs in real time. It's not just about learning math, or science, or history. It's about teaching kids how to think, how to problem solve, and how to approach challenges from a place of curiosity. Paul listened intently. He knew that this was a groundbreaking idea, one that could change everything about how education worked. The platform they were building would combine AI with adaptive learning algorithms, creating a personalized learning experience for each student. It was ambitious, bold, and incredibly exciting. But as the team continued to discuss technical details, Paul found himself zoning out. His mind kept drifting back to his students, his real, in-the-flesh students, sitting in his classroom every day, looking to him for guidance. Was this new project the right way to impact education? Or was it simply another tech-driven solution that ignored the fundamental human connection that made learning truly meaningful? Paul. Elon's voice broke through his thoughts. What do you think? Paul blinked, pulling himself back into the conversation. Sorry, I was just thinking about something. Elon raised an eyebrow. What's on your mind? I think this project is incredible, Paul said slowly. But we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the human element in all of this. The technology is amazing, but it has to be designed to support, not replace, real teachers. The personal connection between a student and a teacher is what makes education truly impactful. We can't forget that. Elon nodded thoughtfully. You're right, he said. We're not looking to replace teachers. But we do want to give them the tools they need to make learning more personalized, more engaging, and more accessible. If we can help teachers do their jobs better, then the entire system benefits. Paul felt a surge of relief. He had been afraid that the project would veer too far into automation and technology, leaving behind the very thing that made education meaningful. But Musk's response reassured him. This wasn't about replacing teachers, it was about empowering them. As the meeting wrapped up, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was still unsure of how he would balance this project with his teaching career and family life, but one thing was clear: this project had the potential to revolutionize education, and he was going to be a part of it. That evening, as Paul sat down to dinner with Sarah, he made an effort to be present. He put his phone away and focused on the conversation. Sarah seemed relieved to see him making an effort to reconnect, and they spent the evening talking about their plans for the weekend getaway. I'm really glad we're going to take a break, Paul said, pushing his plate aside. I've been so caught up in everything that I've forgotten how important it is to just be with you and the kids. Sarah smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. It's been a while since we've had some quality time together. I think it'll do us good. Paul nodded. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was starting to realize that he couldn't do it all alone. He needed balance, both for himself and for his family. As they finished dinner and began planning their weekend trip, Paul felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to walk it with purpose, with clarity, and most importantly, with the people he loved by his side. The weekend getaway with Sarah and the kids was exactly what Paul needed. It had been a brief respite from the chaos of his dual responsibilities, but in the few days they spent away from the city, Paul rediscovered something important: his sense of balance. They spent the days hiking through the mountains, fishing by the lake, and laughing around a campfire at night. For the first time in what felt like months, he didn't think about calculus problems or educational algorithms. He didn't think about his next meeting with Elon Musk or the weight of his new project. He was simply Paul, the father, the husband, the teacher. But as the weekend came to a close and the family drove back to their busy lives, the reality of his commitments began to settle in again. The projects waiting on his desk, the emails from Musk and the team, the constant reminders of how much time he was spending away from his classroom and home, it was all waiting for him, just as it had before. That Monday morning, after a quiet breakfast with Sarah, Paul kissed her goodbye and left for school, determined to give his students the same level of focus he had given the family over the weekend. It wasn't going to be easy. The pull of the new project was undeniable, but the classroom was his anchor. When he arrived at school, Paul was greeted by his students with smiles and the usual chatter. It was a comforting routine, standing in front of the whiteboard, explaining complex equations, and helping his students navigate through the labyrinth of calculus. The familiar faces, the eager questions, the excitement in their eyes when they solved a difficult problem, it was all he needed to remind himself why he loved teaching in the first place. But as the day wore on, the weight of his commitment started to feel heavier. He checked his phone during lunch and saw multiple missed calls from Elon's assistant. There were updates about the project, discussions about timelines, and urgent emails that needed his input. As he read through them, he felt a sense of panic rising in his chest. There was so much to do, so much riding on this. His students deserved his full attention, but so did the project. After class, Paul sat in his office, staring at his phone. He couldn't ignore the messages anymore. It was time to make a decision. The reality of balancing his teaching career with his new project was hitting him hard. How could he continue to give his best to his students when his mind was constantly pulled in a different direction? How could he give his best to Musk's project without sacrificing the one thing that grounded him? Suddenly, his door opened, and in walked his longtime friend and colleague, Karen. She had been teaching at the school for years and had always been there to offer advice when Paul needed it. "Paul, I've been hearing things around the halls," she said, sitting down across from him. "Some of the other teachers are talking. You're really taking on a lot, aren't you? Between the project with Musk and your full-time teaching load, you don't seem like yourself lately." Paul let out a sigh and leaned back in his chair. "I feel like I'm losing my grip, Karen. I'm spread so thin, and I don't know how to keep juggling it all. My students deserve more, my family deserves more, and this project with Elon, it's like I'm being pulled in 1,000 different directions." Karen looked at him sympathetically. "You can't do everything, Paul. You're only human. You have to figure out where your priorities are, what matters most. And it's okay to say no to things, even if they seem like once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. You have to decide what kind of life you want to lead." Paul thought about Karen's words for a moment. The pressure had been building for weeks, and he knew that he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. "I don't want to disappoint anyone," Paul said quietly. "But I think you're right. I need to make some hard choices." Karen gave him a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Paul. You always do." The next day, Paul met with Elon Musk for their weekly update meeting. They sat in a sleek conference room at the project headquarters, surrounded by whiteboards filled with diagrams and flowcharts. Musk was his usual energetic self, diving into the details of the project with enthusiasm. "We've made some great progress," Musk said. "The platform's going to launch in the next few months, and we need to finalize the curriculum development. I need your input on the next steps, Paul." Paul listened intently, but his mind was elsewhere. As Musk spoke, he could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. This was a turning point. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he knew that the only way to move forward was to be honest with himself. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Elon," he said, his voice steady but resolute, "I need to be upfront with you. I've been trying to balance everything, my teaching, the project, my family, and it's been harder than I expected. I can't keep doing both at the same time. It's not fair to my students, it's not fair to my family, and it's not fair to you." Musk paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "I understand, Paul. This is a huge commitment. What are you thinking?" I think I need to step back from the project, Paul said. I can't give it the attention it deserves while trying to juggle everything else. I'm grateful for the opportunity, but my family and my classroom have to come first. Musk leaned back in his chair, considering Paul's words. I respect that. It's not easy to make a decision like this. But I appreciate your honesty. You've been a valuable part of the team, and if this is what's best for you, then I support your decision. Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally taking control of his life again. He had made a hard choice, but it was the right one. As Paul left the meeting with Musk, he felt lighter, as though a heavy burden had been lifted. He knew that he was making the right decision for himself, for his family, and for his students. It wasn't the end of his journey, it was just a new chapter. And as he drove home that evening, he couldn't help but smile. He was on the road to finding a new kind of balance, one that would allow him to live with purpose, without losing sight of what truly mattered. The weeks that followed Paul's decision to step back from Elon Musk's project were a time of deep reflection. For the first time in a long while, he was able to focus fully on his teaching and his family, two things that had always been the bedrock of his life. His decision wasn't easy, but as each day passed, he began to realize how much he had been neglecting the very things he cherished the most. Back in the classroom, Paul rediscovered his passion for teaching. The days began to feel more meaningful again as he reconnected with his students. He wasn't distracted by late-night emails or project deadlines anymore. His focus was on them, on their growth, their struggles, and their successes. Every small breakthrough, every moment when a student finally understood a concept, brought him a sense of fulfillment that no high-tech project could ever replicate. One of his students, Olivia, had been struggling with calculus for months. She often stayed after class, frustrated with herself for not grasping the concepts as quickly as her peers. Paul could see the stress on her face, the self-doubt in her eyes. But he also saw her determination to improve. She reminded him of himself at that age, someone who worked tirelessly and, at times, felt defeated but never gave up. One afternoon, Olivia approached him after class, as usual. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Matthews," she said softly, "I think I finally get it. The chain rule. It's not just a formula anymore, it's a way of thinking about the problem." Paul smiled. He could see the spark of understanding in her eyes. "I knew you'd get there. You just needed to trust yourself a little more." Olivia nodded, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews. For not giving up on me." In that moment, Paul felt something deep within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. Teaching wasn't just about imparting knowledge, it was about shaping young minds, building confidence, and guiding them through the challenges of life. And for the first time in a while, Paul felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. At home, things were also improving. Sarah had noticed the change in him. He was present again, both physically and emotionally. The evenings they spent together were no longer interrupted by phone calls or thoughts of the latest project deadlines. Instead, they sat down for dinner, enjoyed each other's company, and talked about their days. It was simple, but it was enough. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Sarah turned to Paul with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I've noticed something lately. You've been so much more, you. Not that you were ever a stranger, but it's like you found your balance again. I can see how much you love teaching. I think you made the right choice, Paul." Paul smiled, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I think I did too. I've been so caught up in what I thought was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that I almost forgot what really matters. This, teaching, being with you and the kids, this is my real purpose." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you. I know it wasn't easy, but you've made the right choice for all of us." That night, Paul lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the path he had chosen. It wasn't the path he had originally envisioned for himself, at least, not the one that involved Musk's grand educational revolution. But it was his path, and it was a good one. Meanwhile, back at Musk's project, things were moving forward without Paul. Elon Musk had respected his decision and continued with the development of the platform. In some ways, Paul still felt the pull of the project. He wondered what might have been if he had stayed involved, but he knew deep down that he had made the right choice. The project was still progressing, and Musk's vision was coming to life. Paul knew that his contribution, while significant, was just one part of a much larger effort. And while it stung to step away from something so groundbreaking, he was okay with it. It was part of the journey, and it was helping him grow in ways he hadn't expected. But even as he continued to devote himself fully to teaching, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. He had always been someone who sought to push the boundaries of what was possible, whether in the classroom or in his personal life. Now, having stepped back from the massive project, he realized that there were still other ways he could make a significant impact on the world of education. He didn't need to be at the forefront of a high-profile project to make a difference. It was during one of his quiet moments at home, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, that the idea struck him. He had always been passionate about reforming education, about making it more accessible, more personalized, and more relevant to today's world. He'd had his doubts about the tech-heavy nature of Musk's project, but he still believed in the power of innovation. What if, instead of relying on others to shape the future of education, he took matters into his own hands? The following days were a blur of brainstorming sessions, late-night writing, and researching the latest trends in education technology. Paul began to sketch out a new idea, one that focused on integrating the personal touch of great teachers with the power of technology. It would be a platform that didn't replace educators but enhanced their abilities, giving them tools to connect with students on a deeper level. It would allow teachers to create personalized learning paths for their students, using data and AI not as a replacement for human interaction but as a means of amplifying it. Paul was determined to create something that would bridge the gap between technology and the essential human element in education. It wasn't about flashy apps or revolutionary algorithms. It was about creating a system that empowered teachers to do their jobs better, and in doing so, help students reach their fullest potential. As he sat in front of his laptop one evening, typing out the first draft of his proposal, Paul realized that this was the beginning of something new. He didn't need to chase after every new opportunity that came his way. The path he was on, the one that combined his love for teaching with his passion for innovation, was the one that felt right. And for the first time in a long time, Paul felt a deep sense of peace. This was just the beginning. The days following Paul's revelation were filled with new energy. He had rekindled his passion for teaching, but now, there was an undeniable spark of ambition, a drive to do something that could change the landscape of education, not just for his students, but for teachers everywhere. The project he was now envisioning wasn't just about fancy technology. It was about giving educators the tools to be better, to connect with their students more deeply, and to personalize learning in a way that felt human, not robotic. It wasn't going to be easy. Paul knew that. But he was determined. The first step was a pitch. He needed to gather resources, support, and most importantly, partners. This wouldn't be a one-man show. Paul understood that now. He had the vision, the experience, and the heart, but he would need like-minded people to bring this idea to life. Paul's first call was to Karen, his colleague at school. She had always been a reliable sounding board, and he trusted her judgment. Karen, Paul began, after she picked up the phone, I've been thinking a lot lately about the direction I want to take in education. And I've got this idea, a platform, one that would give teachers the tools to create personalized learning paths for their students. I want to combine technology and teaching in a way that actually helps educators. No more of this, tech will replace teachers nonsense. The idea is to enhance what we do, not replace it. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then, Karen responded, her voice filled with curiosity and excitement. That sounds amazing, Paul. I've seen how passionate you are about this. But, You know this is going to be a huge undertaking, right? You can't do it alone. Paul nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I know. But I'm committed. I want this to be something that helps teachers at every level. Not just the ones at the cutting edge, but those who are in classrooms like mine, teachers who are dedicated, but don't always have the resources they need. I love it, Karen said. Let's sit down and talk about the details. But I think you're onto something big. A few days later, Paul and Karen met at a local coffee shop to discuss the next steps. Paul had drafted a rough outline of his idea, and they pored over it, refining the concept, brainstorming possible features, and considering potential hurdles. Paul had a clear vision, but Karen had the experience to know how to turn it into something tangible. They began drawing up plans for the platform, how it could integrate with existing school systems, how it could help teachers customize lessons based on students' needs, and how data could be used to provide real-time feedback. This has the potential to be something that truly changes how we teach, Karen said, as she sipped her coffee. It's not just about making lessons more engaging, it's about empowering teachers with the tools they need to reach their students. And let's be honest, that's the one thing most educators are missing, the time and the resources. Paul nodded. Exactly. It's not about making teachers work harder, it's about giving them the tools to work smarter. But despite their excitement and momentum, there were challenges ahead. They would need funding, technological expertise, and a network of educators who believed in the vision. It wasn't going to be easy, and as Paul knew all too well, the road ahead would be full of obstacles. Paul decided to reach out to his former contacts, people he had worked with during his brief involvement with Musk's project. He knew that the education tech world was full of visionaries, and if he could tap into the right network, this could grow into something truly special. He wasn't expecting them to drop everything and help him, but he knew that some of them would be intrigued by his idea. His first call was to Robert, a software developer who had been part of the original team that helped design Musk's platform. Robert had always been fascinated by the intersection of education and technology, and Paul hoped he might be interested in collaborating on something new. Hey, Robert, it's Paul, he said when Robert picked up. I know we haven't talked in a while, but I've got a project I think you might be interested in. It's about developing a platform that gives teachers the tools to personalize education for their students, helping them to create learning paths that are tailored to each individual. It's not about replacing teachers with AI, it's about enhancing their abilities. There was a pause before Robert spoke. That sounds interesting, Paul. You know I've always been passionate about education. I'll need to hear more about what you're envisioning. Let's set up a meeting. That evening, Paul sat at his desk, scribbling down the details of what he wanted to create. He wasn't sure how he was going to get everything in motion, but he knew that if he could just get the right people on board, it could be something transformative. He needed developers, yes, but he also needed educators who would be willing to pilot the platform in real classrooms. He needed real feedback, real-world testing, to make sure this wasn't just another tech gimmick, it had to be practical and effective. In the weeks that followed, Paul and Karen worked tirelessly to outline their project and gather a team. They reached out to a few other educators who shared their vision, including a few friends from neighboring schools who were eager to innovate but lacked the resources to do so. Slowly, but surely, the team grew. They also began drafting their pitch for investors, hoping to secure funding to develop the platform. The road was still uncertain, and there were plenty of sleepless nights, but Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was the first time in a long time that he wasn't running away from something, he was running towards something, a new opportunity to make a lasting impact on the future of education. On a crisp fall morning, a few months later, Paul stood at the front of a crowded conference room, a team of passionate educators and developers beside him. They were presenting their platform to a group of potential investors who were skeptical but intrigued. This was their chance, the culmination of months of hard work, late nights, and early mornings. Paul took a deep breath and began. Education is changing. And not all of it is for the better. Teachers are under more pressure than ever, and students are falling behind because they don't have the personalized attention they need. What if we could change that? What if we could give teachers the tools they need to create personalized learning experiences for every student, using the power of data and technology to enhance their teaching without replacing it? The room was silent as the investors listened intently. Paul continued, his voice steady but full of conviction. This platform isn't just another app, it's a new way of thinking about education. It's about empowering teachers and students alike to thrive. And with your support, we can make this vision a reality. As he finished his pitch, Paul felt a rush of excitement and nervousness. It was a leap of faith, but it was one he was ready to take. And with the team he had behind him, he was more confident than ever that this could be the beginning of something big. The days following the pitch were a blur. Paul, Karen, and the rest of their small but growing team anxiously awaited feedback from the investors. Despite the nerves, Paul couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished so far. It wasn't just the idea, it was the passion and hard work that had gone into bringing it to life. He had no illusions that the journey ahead would be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. 2 weeks later, the call came. Paul was sitting in his office at the school, grading papers when his phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number, and his heart skipped a beat. With a quick glance at the clock, he answered. "Hello, Paul Matthews." "This is Paul," he replied, holding his breath. "Who's this?" "This is Greg Collins, from Summit Ventures. We met a few weeks ago, remember?" Paul's mind raced. Summit Ventures was one of the most respected venture capital firms in the education tech industry. They were the kind of investors who could make or break a startup like his. Greg continued speaking, and Paul had to focus to keep up. "We've discussed your pitch internally, and I have to say, we're impressed. You've got something here. We want to move forward with a round of funding. We believe in what you're trying to accomplish, and we want to help make it a reality." Paul's breath caught in his throat. "You're serious?" "Absolutely. We want to set up a meeting to go over the terms, and if everything looks good, we can start working on the next steps." Paul let out a long breath, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized was there lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't expected it to happen this quickly, but there it was, an opportunity, a chance to take everything to the next level. "Thank you so much, Greg. This means everything to us." Greg chuckled. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got a lot of work to do. Let's schedule a meeting for next week and we'll go over everything." The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and the week leading up to it felt like a blur of preparation. Paul and Karen worked around the clock to finalize their proposal, gathering data, refining the platform's features, and preparing answers to every possible question that might come up. They knew that this was their big break, and they needed to be ready for anything. On the day of the meeting, Paul felt a mix of excitement and nerves. As he walked into Summit Ventures' sleek, modern office, he couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a world far beyond his own. The building was filled with glass walls, open spaces, and people who all seemed to move with purpose and confidence. Greg greeted Paul and Karen warmly, and they were ushered into a conference room where a group of investors waited. The room was full of sharp suits, smart minds, and inquisitive expressions. This was where the magic happened, Paul thought. After a brief introduction, Greg took the lead. "We've all reviewed your pitch, and we're on board with the concept. What we want to focus on today is the potential for scalability. Can your platform work across different school districts? Can it integrate with existing systems? And how do you plan to make sure teachers adopt it?" Paul felt the questions come fast and furious, but he was ready. He and Karen had anticipated these concerns, and they both spoke confidently about their plan. They explained the adaptive nature of the platform, how it could integrate with any school's existing systems, and how they had built in user-friendly features that would make it easy for teachers to adopt without a steep learning curve. But the real breakthrough came when Paul spoke about the platform's potential to foster collaboration among teachers. He explained how it could allow educators to share lesson plans, insights, and data with one another, creating a community of practice that extended beyond the classroom. "We're not just building a tool for teachers," Paul said. "We're building a community, a support network that allows teachers to collaborate, grow, and learn from one another. It's about making every teacher feel supported, no matter where they are in their career." Greg raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's an interesting angle. I like it. Teachers often feel isolated, especially in districts where resources are limited." "Exactly," Paul said. "This platform is about giving teachers the resources they need to succeed, while also connecting them to others who share the same mission. Education is a collaborative effort, and the more we can support one another, the more effective we can be." The meeting lasted for several hours, and by the end of it, Paul felt a sense of cautious optimism. He had done his best to answer every question, to address every concern, and to paint a picture of a future where teachers weren't just managing technology, they were mastering it, using it to transform their classrooms and connect with their students in meaningful ways. As they left the building, Paul and Karen exchanged a look. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both still processing the enormity of what had just transpired. "I think we did it," Karen finally said, her voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "I think we did," Paul agreed, though a small part of him was still unsure. The road ahead was still long, and there were plenty of hurdles left to overcome. But this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. With some adventures backing them, they were about to take their platform to the next level. A few days later, Paul received another call from Greg. This time, it was to confirm the deal. Summit Ventures was officially on board, and they would be providing the initial round of funding to help Paul's team bring their vision to life. The weight of it hit Paul all at once. They had done it. The future of education was about to change. But for Paul, this wasn't just about building a successful company. It was about doing what he loved, teaching. And now, he had the tools and the team to make a lasting difference. With the funding secured, the team was ready to move forward. But Paul knew that securing the money was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, turning their idea into a fully realized platform that would change the way education was delivered. There was a lot to do, and not just on the technical side. They would need to build a network of educators, test the platform in real-world classrooms, and constantly refine the product to make sure it was as effective as it was visionary. In the first few weeks following the investment, Paul and Karen spent countless hours meeting with developers, designers, and educators to map out the initial stages of development. They knew their platform had to be intuitive, easy to use, and powerful enough to scale across different school districts. But they also had to make sure it didn't lose the human touch. The core of their mission was always to support teachers, not replace them with machines. The first priority was building a prototype. Robert, the software developer Paul had reached out to months ago, came on board to help design the core architecture of the platform. Together, the team worked tirelessly, making sure the platform would provide real-time feedback, personalized lesson plans, and easy access to resources for teachers. Paul often found himself buried in meetings, discussions, and brainstorming sessions with the development team. The pace was relentless, but he thrived in the chaos. It felt good to be working towards something that had the potential to reshape the educational landscape. Every day brought new challenges, but also new breakthroughs, whether it was discovering a better way to integrate data, or finding creative solutions to improve user interface design. At the same time, Karen was spearheading outreach efforts, engaging with school districts and teachers to gauge interest and begin testing the platform in real-world settings. She visited schools, gave presentations, and talked to educators about their needs. The feedback was invaluable. Teachers were excited, but they also had concerns. Some feared the platform might be too complicated to use, while others worried it might take too much time away from actual teaching. "You need to listen to their concerns," Paul said to Karen one evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with a group of teachers. "We're building this for them, and if they don't feel comfortable with it, it's all for nothing." "I know," Karen said, her face weary but resolute. But the more we listen, the more we realize that they don't want technology to take over, they want it to make their jobs easier. They want something that's intuitive, something that doesn't require hours of training just to learn how to use it. Paul nodded. That's why we need to make sure it's simple but powerful. We need to give them the tools they need without overwhelming them. By the time the first version of the platform was ready for testing, Paul and Karen had built a network of teachers who were eager to give it a shot. It was a nerve-wracking moment. The product had come a long way, but there was still a nagging doubt in Paul's mind: what if it wasn't enough? What if the teachers didn't connect with it the way he'd hoped? They launched the test phase in a small group of classrooms in the nearby district. The first day was full of anticipation. Paul and Karen sat in the back of the classrooms, observing as the teachers began using the platform for the first time. As they watched, Paul felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Would the teachers like it? Would the students respond to it? The platform was designed to help teachers track their students' progress, offer personalized learning suggestions, and help educators work more collaboratively, but all of that would mean nothing if it didn't actually make teaching easier and more effective. At the end of the first day, Paul and Karen collected feedback from the teachers. Some loved it. Teachers who were already tech-savvy found it intuitive and easy to use. Others had concerns, mostly about how much time it took to input data and how the platform could be better tailored to specific learning needs. But there was a consensus that the platform had potential. Teachers wanted more customization, more options to tweak the platform to fit the unique needs of their classrooms. They also wanted a faster, more intuitive way to track students' progress without getting bogged down in data entry. These teachers are giving us golden nuggets, Karen said, reviewing the feedback later that evening. They want flexibility, but they don't want to sacrifice time. They're telling us exactly what they need. Paul agreed, feeling more confident after the test phase. We're on the right track. But we need to streamline the process. It needs to be effortless for them. Let's prioritize customization and speed. As the weeks went on, the team worked hard to make the necessary changes. They simplified the data input process, making it as intuitive as possible. They added more options for customizing lesson plans, allowing teachers to select different learning pathways based on student performance. And they improved the user interface to make navigation smoother. By the time they were ready for the second round of testing, Paul felt more confident in the platform's potential. They had listened to the teachers, adjusted accordingly, and now they were ready to see if their changes made a difference. This time, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Teachers were impressed with how much easier it was to use, and students were more engaged with the lessons. It felt like a breakthrough moment. This was what they had worked for. They were finally seeing the vision come to life. But despite the positive feedback, Paul knew they were only at the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, filled with obstacles to overcome and challenges to face. The platform needed to be scalable, it needed to be reliable, and it needed to reach teachers across the country, not just in one district. As Paul sat in his office late one evening, reflecting on the journey so far, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had come so far, but the real test was still ahead. The next phase of development would require more resources, more testing, and more support. But for now, they had a product that worked. And that was something to celebrate. With the second round of testing behind them, Paul and Karen were at a crossroads. They had proven that the platform worked in a small-scale setting, but now they had to scale it. It wasn't just about making the platform available to more teachers, it was about making sure it could handle the demands of schools across the country, each with its own unique set of challenges, needs, and technological capabilities. The first step was to expand their testing. They couldn't afford to stay in one district anymore. The world was watching, investors, educators, even competitors. They had to prove that their platform could work across multiple regions, in diverse environments, and still deliver the same level of support for teachers and students. Paul and Karen had a clear plan. They needed to partner with a few key school districts in different regions to test the platform on a larger scale. They chose a district in California, one in Texas, and another in Florida. These districts were chosen for their variety, different levels of funding, diverse student populations, and different educational priorities. If the platform could work across these three districts, it would prove its versatility and scalability. But with scaling came new challenges. The first of these was technical. The infrastructure had to be ready. The platform needed to handle more traffic, more data, and more users without compromising its performance. Robert, the developer, was working overtime, ensuring the system could scale seamlessly. He and the tech team were building redundancies into the system, ensuring that even if one part of the infrastructure failed, the platform would still run smoothly. At the same time, Karen took the lead in outreach. She began working with district officials, arranging meetings to introduce them to the platform, explain how it could help teachers, and begin the process of onboarding. It was clear that the success of the platform didn't just depend on the technology, it depended on getting buy-in from the educators who would be using it every day. The first of these meetings took place in California. Paul and Karen arrived early, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in their stomachs. This was the moment that would decide whether their vision could truly take flight. If the district liked what they saw, it would open doors to others. If they didn't, it could set them back months. The meeting room was large, and the group of educators and administrators seemed skeptical. California, with its progressive educational policies, was a tough crowd to win over. They were used to innovation, but they didn't suffer fools lightly. Greg, who had flown out to California with them to lend his support, kicked off the presentation. He spoke confidently about the investment and the potential for the platform, but it was Paul's turn that mattered most. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a teacher. And it was that personal connection that resonated. "We understand the pressures you face every day," Paul said, his voice steady but passionate. "We're not here to add more work to your plate, we're here to help you teach better, to make your life easier, and to help your students succeed. This isn't just about technology. It's about a community of educators who can work together, share resources, and make an impact on a larger scale." As Paul spoke, the room grew quieter. Teachers and administrators leaned forward, sensing that this wasn't just another tech product. This was something personal, something grounded in real teaching experience. They asked questions, hard questions, but Paul had answers. He talked about the platform's adaptability, its ease of use, and how it could be tailored to fit each teacher's needs. By the end of the meeting, it was clear they had made an impression. The district officials were intrigued, and the teachers were excited. One of the administrators even approached Paul afterward, shaking his hand. "We'd like to give this a shot. We're willing to pilot it in a few schools." It wasn't a full-scale adoption yet, but it was a victory. California, one of the hardest markets to crack, had shown interest. Next, they turned their focus to Texas. The process here was different, there were more hoops to jump through, more bureaucracy, but the challenge was invigorating. Karen worked with local educators to present the platform in a way that spoke to Texas-specific needs, accountability, measurable outcomes, and practical tools for teachers. Texas was a different beast entirely. The feedback was mixed, and Paul could sense the reluctance in some of the teachers' voices. They had been burned by tech solutions that promised much but delivered little. Some of the teachers were concerned about the additional training required to implement a new system, while others wanted more assurance that it would actually make a difference in their classrooms. It was frustrating at times, but Paul knew this was part of the process. Over the course of several meetings, they were able to refine their pitch, offering more tailored solutions for the Texas educators' concerns. By the end of the month, the district agreed to a pilot program. Florida, the final district in their trial expansion, proved to be their smoothest collaboration. With a mix of urban and rural schools, Florida's educational environment presented unique challenges. But they were more open to innovation than Paul had expected. The teachers were eager for something that could bridge the gap between the most resourceful schools and the underfunded ones. They embraced the idea of the platform's ability to level the playing field, providing every teacher with access to the same high-quality resources. After a series of successful meetings and several rounds of testing, Florida also agreed to move forward with a pilot program. As the pilots began in these 3 districts, the reality of scaling the platform began to set in. Paul and Karen worked around the clock, communicating with school officials, collecting data, and refining the platform based on feedback. The support team grew, and the stress of managing multiple pilot programs began to take its toll. But they were doing it. They were scaling. They were on the brink of something big. And yet, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still ahead. What would happen once the pilots were over? What would happen if these districts adopted the platform and then it didn't live up to their expectations? Could they handle the growing demand? And what about the rest of the country? He knew there was no turning back now. They had come too far to stop. And with the momentum building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and determination. The vision was taking shape, and nothing would stand in their way. The pilots in California, Texas, and Florida were progressing better than Paul and Karen had hoped. Positive feedback from teachers poured in, and even administrators were beginning to see the value in the platform. Everything seemed to be moving forward. Yet, with success came new challenges that neither of them had anticipated. And in the fast-paced world of education tech, success can quickly turn into a double-edged sword. It started with a phone call Paul received late one Thursday evening. It was Greg, sounding unusually tense on the other end. "Paul, you need to sit down. I've just received a call from one of our major investors," Greg said, his voice tinged with concern. "They're pulling back. They're not happy with the pace at which we're scaling." Paul froze. "What do you mean?" "We've made huge strides with the pilots, teachers are giving us glowing feedback. The platform's working better than we expected." I know, Greg replied. "But the investors aren't seeing the return they expected fast enough. They want faster results, more aggressive growth. They're pressuring us to scale even quicker, and they're not giving us much room to breathe." Paul's stomach dropped. He knew this day would come. He had seen the impatience in the eyes of investors when they first met, but he hadn't anticipated it coming so soon, so suddenly. The pressure to deliver immediate results could break a company. And they weren't even finished with the pilot phase. The next morning, Paul and Karen met in their office, the weight of the news hanging heavily between them. "What now?" Karen asked, her face strained. "Do we push ahead with a more aggressive timeline and risk compromising the quality? Or do we scale back, which might lose us the investors?" Paul leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We don't compromise quality. That's why we started this in the first place. But we can't lose the investors either. If we don't meet their expectations soon, we could be in real trouble." For hours, they brainstormed. They considered reaching out to other investors for additional funding, but the timing was tricky. If they didn't act fast, they could lose the momentum they had built. But what other choice did they have? Finally, they reached a decision: they would speed up their timeline, but only to the extent that they could maintain the integrity of the platform. They would focus on improving the scalability of the platform without sacrificing user experience. They could extend their testing period slightly to fine-tune the platform, but the overall direction had to be clear. They needed to keep pushing forward. "We'll work weekends if we have to," Paul said, determination in his voice. "We'll focus on getting this to a point where we can handle national-scale deployment." The pressure started to mount. The team worked tirelessly, fueled by the fear of failure and the pressure to succeed. Long hours in front of computer screens, endless meetings, and an ever-growing to-do list became the new normal. Robert, the developer, was up at all hours of the night, tweaking the platform's infrastructure to make sure it could handle an influx of users without crashing. Meanwhile, Karen traveled between the 3 pilot districts, working with educators and administrators to ensure they had everything they needed. She handled complaints, big and small, with grace and patience, but even she was starting to feel the strain. Teachers had begun to voice concerns about the platform's speed. Some found it slow at times, and others were still struggling with the setup process. Despite the stress, they pushed ahead, knowing that failure wasn't an option. But just as things seemed like they might be getting under control, another issue cropped up, one that none of them had anticipated. It was the first week of September when they got the call. The district in California, the one that had agreed to the pilot program early on, was considering pulling out. They had encountered a technical glitch during a particularly busy week in the school year. Students were logging in to access the platform, but they were receiving error messages instead of the resources they needed. It was a disaster. Paul and Karen scrambled to fix the problem, working through the night to debug the system. Robert and the development team were stretched thin, but they promised they would get to the bottom of it. "We'll get it fixed," Paul reassured the district's technical director when he spoke with him. "We're on it. Just give us a little more time." But time was something they didn't have. By the next morning, word of the glitch had spread, and teachers were frustrated. The district administrators were worried about the impact it would have on the students' performance and the district's reputation. And with that, the decision to pull out was on the table. It felt like everything was falling apart in that moment. Just when things seemed like they were moving in the right direction, they were hit with a major roadblock. How could they recover from this? Paul and Karen spent the next several days working non-stop to resolve the technical issue. Robert and his team worked in shifts, narrowing down the source of the glitch to an overloaded server that wasn't able to handle the large volume of traffic from multiple schools at once. It was a simple issue, but it had escalated quickly due to the sheer scale of the testing. It would take time to fully rectify, but it was solvable. During that week, Paul realized something: they had underestimated the complexity of scaling. What they thought was a minor issue had become a full-scale crisis, one that could potentially ruin their credibility with teachers and investors alike. Every mistake, no matter how small, was magnified at scale. They had taken on more than they were ready for, and it was starting to show. But just as Paul was about to lose hope, something unexpected happened. The California district called again. They had fixed the problem internally, but they were willing to give the platform another chance. "We believe in what you're trying to do," the district's technical director said over the phone. "We've seen the potential. If you can guarantee that this won't happen again, we'll keep working with you." It was a moment of relief. Paul felt like he could finally breathe again. In the end, the setback in California was a wake-up call. Paul and Karen knew they had to be more careful as they scaled. But the experience also made them stronger. They knew that if they could survive this crisis, they could survive anything. The road ahead would be challenging, but they were more determined than ever to push forward. The setback in California had rattled everyone on the team, but it had also shown Paul and Karen a crucial truth: growth came with risks, and setbacks were inevitable. It was how they responded to those challenges that would define their success. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. Scaling wasn't just about growing fast, it was about growing smart. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, late-night coding sessions, and strategic planning. They weren't just fixing problems anymore, they were ensuring that their platform could handle the demands of a larger user base without faltering. They hired additional developers to help Robert's team, bringing in experts who had experience scaling tech platforms for major industries. Their primary focus now was reliability. While Paul and Karen worked to stabilize the technical side of things, they also turned their attention to the business side. They needed more investors, more partners, and more schools to adopt their platform. They couldn't afford to lose momentum now, not when they were on the edge of something big. But the pressure was taking its toll. The weight of the world seemed to rest on their shoulders, and even their once steadfast optimism was beginning to waver. One evening, as Paul sat in his office, the familiar sound of a ping from his phone caught his attention. It was an email from one of the investors, yet another message about the need for faster growth. The pressure had only intensified, and the constant demand for results had begun to feel suffocating. How could they move faster without compromising the very essence of what they had built? Was it even possible to maintain quality while racing to meet deadlines and investor demands? Can we really do this? Paul muttered under his breath, looking out the window. He was tired, more tired than he'd ever been. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, it was wearing him down. But he couldn't stop now. Not after everything they had invested. At that moment, Karen knocked lightly on the door. She stepped inside, holding a cup of coffee. "We need to talk," she said, her voice soft but firm. Paul turned to her, unsure of what to expect. "What's on your mind?" Karen sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about all the pressure we're under, and I think we need to reassess our approach. The investors want faster results. They're pushing us to scale even faster, but I'm not sure that's the right move. We've built something solid, but we need to be cautious. We can't rush this." Paul let out a heavy sigh. "I know. But the pressure is overwhelming. Every investor is looking for instant returns. They don't want to wait." "I know," Karen replied. "But if we scale too quickly, we might lose what makes us different. What makes us special. I think we need to take a step back and focus on quality over speed. Let's prove we can handle a manageable, high-quality scale and grow from there. We don't need to change everything overnight." Paul paused, taking in her words. "You're right. It's easy to get caught up in all the noise and the urgency, but we can't lose sight of what we're trying to accomplish. We can't sacrifice quality for quantity." There it was, the turning point. Paul realized that he'd been so focused on pushing forward at full speed that he had lost sight of the very thing that had motivated them to start this venture, making a lasting impact on education. And that impact didn't have to happen in an instant. It had to be sustainable. They decided to take a more deliberate approach. They would focus on perfecting the platform for the schools that were already on board and slowly expand from there. Quality control would be their priority, no more rushing through the scaling process. They needed to prove that their platform could handle larger numbers, but it also had to continue to meet the needs of teachers and students in the most meaningful ways. Karen and Paul took a trip to each of the 3 pilot districts to personally check in with the teachers. They wanted to hear feedback, honest, constructive feedback that could help them refine the platform further. They knew the product was strong, but they needed to make sure it worked in the classrooms and not just in the tech world. In California, they met with Mrs. Thompson, a middle school teacher who had been using the platform since the pilot started. She was enthusiastic about its potential but had some suggestions. "I love how the platform allows me to find resources quickly," Mrs. Thompson said, showing them her lesson plan on the screen. "But sometimes, the search function is slow. And the student performance tracking isn't as detailed as I'd like. I need to see where each student is struggling so I can address their needs in real time." Paul took notes furiously, and Karen made sure to reassure her that the team would work on it. "These are exactly the kinds of insights we need. We're committed to improving this experience for you." In Texas, they spoke with Mr. Rodriguez, a high school physics teacher, who shared similar feedback. "The platform is great for collaboration, but we need a way to integrate it with our existing systems. Right now, it feels like I have to switch between too many tools to get everything done." This was valuable insight. They knew that integration with existing systems was a key feature many schools were looking for. It wasn't just about having a new tool, it was about making that tool fit into the existing framework. Finally, in Florida, they met with Principal Evans, who had been instrumental in pushing for the platform's adoption in her district. "I see the potential here," she said, "but we need to ensure that there's a system for ongoing support. Teachers are overwhelmed, and if they can't get help when they need it, they'll abandon the platform." That was a wake-up call. Paul and Karen realized they hadn't fully anticipated the amount of support teachers would need during the transition. They needed to create a robust system of ongoing training and assistance to help teachers feel confident in using the platform. As they returned to their office, Paul and Karen felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had received valuable feedback, and they had a clearer vision of what needed to be done. It was time to slow down, to refocus on their core mission, and to make sure their platform was truly serving the teachers and students who needed it the most. They were on the right path, but it was a long road ahead. The next phase wasn't about rushing to scale, it was about building something that would last. The months following their decision to scale thoughtfully were both challenging and rewarding. Paul and Karen had learned many hard lessons from their setbacks, but the changes they made, both to the platform and to their approach, were beginning to pay off. They had given themselves permission to slow down and build with purpose, rather than rushing to meet investors' immediate demands. One of the most significant changes they made was the way they approached customer support and training. They set up an extensive, 24/7 support system for teachers, complete with dedicated training sessions and detailed guides for teachers of all tech levels. Paul had thought that the tool would sell itself, that once teachers saw the platform in action, they would intuitively know how to use it. But Karen had been right all along, teachers needed support, and they needed it consistently. The feedback from the teachers in the pilot districts was overwhelmingly positive. Their experience with the platform had improved, not just in terms of functionality, but in their overall comfort and confidence using it. Principal Evans from Florida even mentioned during a follow-up meeting, "We've seen an uptick in student engagement because of how easy it is for teachers to track their progress. It's making a real difference." Paul was filled with a sense of pride as he and Karen reviewed the updates. They were inching closer to a moment that had seemed unreachable just a few months ago: nationwide expansion. The road ahead still had plenty of bumps, but they now had the clarity to see them coming. They were no longer simply reacting, they were planning for the future. One day, as they sat in their office, reviewing feedback from a teacher in New Jersey, the phone rang. Paul picked it up, expecting it to be another query from a teacher. But when he heard Greg's voice on the other end, he tensed. "Paul, I've got news," Greg said, the tone of his voice signaling something important. "What's up?" Paul asked, his heart rate picking up. "I just got off the phone with the investors," Greg said. "They're impressed with what we've done. They see the potential now. They're willing to give us a significant amount of additional funding, but there's a catch." Paul's eyebrows furrowed. "What's the catch?" "They want us to scale faster than we've planned. They want a national rollout by the end of the year." A wave of anxiety washed over Paul. This was the very situation they had been trying to avoid. They had just started to hit their stride, and now they were being asked to sprint again. But, at the same time, this was an opportunity they couldn't afford to ignore. The investors were in their corner, and they needed to decide how to balance their goals with their newfound wisdom. "Let me think about it," Paul replied, his mind racing. He had learned that hasty decisions led to mistakes, and he didn't want to make that error again. That evening, Karen joined Paul in his office. He could see that the news had unsettled her too. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. "I'm torn," Paul confessed. "On one hand, the money gives us the resources to push forward, and a national rollout would validate everything we've worked for. On the other hand, we can't afford to make the same mistakes we did before. We've made progress, and we can't jeopardize the integrity of the platform." Karen nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "We've learned so much in the past few months. We've made the platform stronger, and we've been able to handle the feedback and the growing demand. But we need to stay true to what we're trying to build. We can't let the pressure from investors dictate the pace if it compromises the quality of our product." After a long silence, Paul's expression softened. "We can do it. But we need to make sure we're scaling responsibly. Let's tell the investors that we'll move forward, but we'll need to take a more measured approach. We can't rush. We'll keep growing, but we'll do it in stages, making sure every new district we bring on has the support it needs." Karen smiled, relieved. "That's the right approach." The next morning, Paul called Greg back and conveyed their decision. It wasn't the full-throttle sprint that the investors had wanted, but they were clear about their priorities. They would move forward with the national rollout, but it would be methodical, with careful attention to scaling and support at each stage. Greg, surprisingly, didn't push back. "I'll let them know," he said. "I think they'll understand. You've done a great job with this so far." With that, the decision was made. The final push was now in motion. As the weeks went by, they managed the national rollout with care. They carefully selected districts and schools to bring on board, ensuring that they had the proper infrastructure to handle the growth. Paul, Karen, and their team worked tirelessly to ensure that every step was smooth, from teacher training to tech support to monitoring the system's performance. It wasn't easy, but it was working. Feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and by the time December rolled around, they had expanded to several states. Their platform was now being used in schools across the country. The impact they had dreamed of, the change they wanted to make in education, was finally beginning to take shape. But it wasn't just the teachers and students who saw the value in what they were doing. The investors, too, were satisfied. The growth was sustainable, the quality was intact, and Paul and Karen had proved to everyone, including themselves, that they could build something lasting. One evening, just before the holidays, Paul and Karen stood on the balcony of their office, looking out at the skyline of the city. The air was cold, but it didn't matter. They had done it. They had navigated the storms, weathered the pressure, and built something real. "We did it," Karen said, a smile spreading across her face. Paul nodded, the weight of the journey lifting off his shoulders. "We did. And this is just the beginning." They stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they felt ready for whatever came next. And with that, their story was far from over. There were still more challenges ahead, but they had the experience, the knowledge, and the passion to face whatever the future held. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?